there's nothing unscientific about this enterprise. There's a lot that can go by the name of meditation or, spiritual practice that can seem starkly unscientific because it comes freighted with specifically religious concepts and iconography and things that are being added to your experience, ritualistically or, by virtue of, what you're visualizing or the mantra you're chanting. And all of that can seem like a departure from empirical rigor. And it's not to say that all of those practices need be a departure from empirical rigor. There's a way to stand with the Hare Krishnas and chant without being a religious lunatic, I would argue. But with something like mindfulness, the connection to science, at least potentially, is very direct. All mindfulness is paying very close attention to experience without adding anything to it. There's no mantra, there's no visualization, there's no necessary belief framework. It's just in each moment, you are making an effort to clearly notice whatever you in fact notice, whether it's a sensation in the body or a sight or a sound or a thought or a mood arising in the mind. You're noticing these phenomena, the contents of consciousness, as clearly as possible. And that clear noticing is different from the way you're tending to live in at least two respects. I mean, one is you're tending to live your life, and this is something very few people notice about themselves until they try to meditate. You're tending to live lost in thought. You're thinking every moment of the day without noticing that you're thinking. And your experience of the present moment and your experience of anything you can notice is coming to you through this veil of discursivity that is in fact not noticed by you. So that's the first thing. It's just hard to pay attention because you are thinking every single moment of the day and you're not aware of it. And so you'll try to follow the breath as an initial exercise in mindfulness. And this is a very common experience that people will pay attention to the breath and then feel that they're doing it for even minutes at a time and then say, well, when you ask them what that was like, well, I did it for like 5 minutes, but then I got distracted and then I came back. Whereas, and as everyone discovers on their first retreat, if their life depended on it, they couldn't stay on the breath for anything like 5 minutes. It's hard enough to follow 5 breaths in succession without getting carried away by thought. Yeah, I actually was once on a retreat with the Burmese meditation master, Upandita Sayadaw, whose name I think is familiar to you. It was like a 2-month retreat, and it was set up in such a way that you could hear as you said, that you would have a daily or every other day interview for 10 minutes with the teacher. And this retreat was set up so that you could hear the interview that was happening before you on the retreat. So you're kind of waiting in line, you're in the vestibule waiting for your chance to talk to Upandita. And so I could hear the person in front of me every time I went for an interview. So I was hearing this person say in the beginning, in the first few days of the retreat, that he could, as I just said, he could stay with the breath for maybe 5 minutes and then get lost, and then he would come back to the breath. And, I just recognized at once how absurd that was because this was not my first retreat. But then over the course of maybe 6 weeks, I could hear his experience getting more honest, where he would say that, now maybe he can get 10 breaths in succession and then he's off. That's not a description of a person's ability degrading. That is a description of what it's like to actually equip yourself with the tools to notice how powerfully distracted you are in each moment. And so just to bring one other element in here. So once you can pay attention to experience closely, again, without adding anything to it, you then begin to notice the difference between merely being aware of phenomenon and reacting habitually to phenomenon as described in the Buddhist lexicon, with desire and aversion. And so your tendency to grasp at what's pleasant and push away what's unpleasant, that begins to seem, as in fact it is, a powerful source of disturbance in your mind. And as you know, the Buddhists link that to basically all forms of psychological suffering. But at minimum, this is an automaticity you can relax by merely paying more careful attention to the raw qualities of experience, non-judgmentally, not grasping at what's pleasant and pushing away what's unpleasant. And when you do that, a door into a very different kind of experience of a sort that you just described, with the hated weed, opens. And again, at no point have you stepped away from the spirit of scientific empiricism. You're not believing anything on insufficient evidence. You're not pretending to know something you don't know. You're actually just paying more careful attention to what it's like to be you in each moment. Of course, desire and aversion have been hammered into us by evolution, and they're absolutely necessary for our survival. You're just going to wander off a cliff if you have no desire to stay alive or not suffer some horrible injury. So there's this, I think, understandable sense that a life without desire and aversion would be a bad thing, or in fact, just starkly untenable. You just wouldn't survive a day of it. There's something, I guess we could call a kind of status quo bias here. It's not well understood that the mind, in terms of its kind of raw attention, the powers of attention, can be trained, or that a person can be more or less talented in paying attention. Now, it's obviously in a kind of a physical domain, it's obvious, that there's a difference between an Olympic sprinter and someone who can't even get off the couch, right? I mean, there's a range of athletic abilities is undeniable. And there's a range of intellectual abilities we also recognize, but these run more in the direction of knowledge acquisition and an aptitude for it. So it's not really well understood that just by, looking at the drapes, as you say, most people aren't in a good position even to begin to pay attention. And there really is a scope for real training here, even to get to the starting line in terms of understanding what there is to pay attention to and what the consequences of noticing it might be. And so this is a real barrier that a lot of people never surmount, which is they hear that meditation is a good idea or it has all of these health benefits or psychological benefits, and they want to look into it. And so they try it for 5 minutes or an hour, and they look inside and they just see nothing of interest, really, because they're really just sitting there thinking, whether the legs are crossed or not, and they're not actually able to do the practice to a degree to reveal anything at all. The fact of that failure isn't obvious to them, and this is why taking psychedelics has been the doorway to a real commitment to something like meditation for so many people in the West, because many of us wouldn't have been convinced that there was a there, but for having our normal levels of psychological unhappiness overridden for a time by one or another drug. It's not to say that drug experiences are always a perfect surrogate for what there is to be experienced through meditation, but at a minimum, if you take 100 micrograms of LSD, something is going to happen. Now, it may be very unpleasant. It could be pleasant or unpleasant, but very few people walk away from that experience thinking that it's impossible to change a human experience. I mean, they may think that it was just a drug experience and has no implication for the rest of what's possible in human life. But with meditation, you really do have the problem where you can recommend it to a skeptical person. They can think they've tried it and they've come away thinking that it doesn't work for them, or this is just a totally fraudulent enterprise. People are practicing some elaborate form of self-deception by meditating. Nature didn't equip us to know reality as it is, or ourselves as we are in the world. And it didn't equip us to be as happy as possible either. I mean, natural selection has not been about maximizing the well-being of organisms. It's been about surviving long enough to get your genes into the next generation, and that's it. In the absolute limit case, it's survive long enough so that you can help your progeny get their genes in the next generation. It is not about happiness, obviously. And so virtually everything we care about is at least potentially divorceable from the imperatives of evolution and the logic of evolution. And I guess this is the point I've made before, but if you were going to follow narrowly the logic of evolution and imagine that whatever your genes want must sum to your ultimate happiness, well, then nothing could be better than just donating your sperm to a sperm bank if you're a man. You'll father thousands of children for whom you have no economic responsibility or to, squander no more resources on them. I mean, that's the perfect solution to the human condition. But obviously, that's not the way we live, and that's not what we most want out of life. And most of us want is in each moment to feel much better than we tend to. And in seeking various aims in life, whether they're changes in status or new relationships or tasty things to eat or anything else that we use to change our state, in seeking these things, the logic from a contemplative point of view seems generally to be to find some union with experience where, consciousness achieves its object so fully that the present moment becomes good enough so that we're no longer seeking happiness in the future. Every proffered goal carries with it, at least implicitly, this idea that if you can only achieve that, you'll be able to relax, if only for a time. This will finally do it. The itch will stay scratched. And what both Buddhism and natural selection reveal, or at least their descriptions suggest, is that that is always an illusion. One thing you get out of natural selection is that we systematically overestimate how good things will change us in the positive direction and how bad things will change us in the negative direction. But, the half-life of our pleasures are never what we seem to expect. And in the book, you describe a evolutionary rationale for why that would be so. And obviously, that is something you can notice just by paying close attention to your experience through a technique like mindfulness.